Thanks very much, Don, for that introduction. 2 years ago, I spoke at this summer school on the same subject of public service reform. And on that occasion, I argued that trade unions needed to become advocates of real reform in the public service. And I want to begin this afternoon by saying that my strong belief in the positive role that trade unions can play in reform has not diminished. Indeed, it has been strengthened by the astounding events that we have experienced over the last 9 months. And in my 2007 presentation, I argued that public service reform had been held back by the management-led modernisation agendas set out in national agreements, which I argued were far too focused on industrial relations matters and internal procedures that may mean much to senior managers, but which we have learned to our cost mean little or nothing to those who use and pay for public services. And this failure of public service leaders to put themselves in the citizens' shoes has had the inevitable result that it has become difficult, if not virtually impossible, to convince the public of our desire and our ability to reform. And this despite the massive changes that have happened in internal public service procedures, industrial relations, structures and systems, and despite, it should be said, the very real increases in the range, quantity and quality of the public services we provide to a larger and increasingly complex and demanding society. This afternoon I will argue that the challenge and imperative for reform has changed, and changed utterly, because of the sudden and deep recession and its impact in the form of plummeting exchequer funding and soaring demand for services. But informed by my participation in almost a year now of national partnership discussions, I start with the observation that top management approach to reform has not as yet really changed. The reluctance to leave the comfort zone of internal structures and procedures remains their starting point, and the ability to get them to approach change from the perspective of citizens and service users seems so far as elusive as ever. And lest I be accused of simply pointing the failure at the finger of others, I must also acknowledge that my call in 2007 for trade unions to lead the change agenda has been accepted more in principle than in practice. And in this respect, we lag behind many of our trade union colleagues in Europe. And this must change, and change rapidly, if public service unions are to achieve even our most basic function of protecting our members' direct interests in the present crisis. For this evening's discussion, Joe Mulholland chose the title Reforming the Public Service, How and When. The when part of the question is relatively simple. The answer is now. But the nature of the question how is changed completely by the fallout of today's budgetary and economic crisis, which in public service terms will last for years and possibly decades. In many parts of the private sector, we are seeing downsizing on foot of a collapse in demand. What we face in the public service is massive downsizing in expenditure and numbers employed, accompanied by a huge increase in demand as more and more people become dependent on the services we provide. And change is not necessary because we have a bloated, overstaffed, inefficient, or by and large, overpaid public service. A little over a year ago, the OECD, which trade unions would perceive as an ultra-orthodox body, found the opposite to be the case. Their report, which at the time of publication at least, was welcomed by government, opposition, newspaper editorials, and a lot of commentators, concluded that Irish public servants were delivering high-quality services with fewer resources than comparable countries. But today, we face this massive public sector downsizing because of the collapse in public revenues, which is, as a result, as Colm has said, not of widespread public service waste, but of misguided taxation policy and unacceptable practices in parts of the private sector, here and abroad, most obviously in banking, finance, property and construction. In my 2007 presentation, I said that public services are what define a society and give it its humanity. And when you strip away all the economics, the number crunching, and the slash and burn opportunism that characterises far too much of this debate, that remains the fundamental truth, a truth that will be tested by the decisions we as politicians, trade unions, managers, commentators, citizens and workers take over the next few months and years. And if those of us who believe in quality public services fail to take the initiative, it will pass to others, possibly even external forces, who would be happy to see our public services effectively destroyed. And that's why we need to understand that, unlike all previous initiatives, the challenges we now face is not to reform, and certainly not to simply take out the axe in order to balance the books, but to completely transform our public services, to rapidly change their shape and form so that they can deliver in the new circumstances that we are now living in. And what does that word transformation mean? And let me put my understanding as starkly as I can. The initial challenge is to maintain services at the same level whilst reducing cost. Next, it will require us to improve and expand services while continuing to reduce cost. And it would also demand that we better integrate services, again, with fewer resources. It is an understatement to say that this demands a major change in mindset of politicians, managements, trade union and staff about the scale and implications of transformation and what it will mean for our work and the way we do business. And in this context, the thoughtful citizen will be very wary of the concerted vilification of those who work to deliver public services and the systematic attempt by some to sideline the representative bodies, their unions. This, in my view, is extremely dangerous, not least because trade unions must have a key role in delivering the message of transformation and finding the solutions on the grounds if cooperation, rather than a confrontational approach to this major challenge, is to be found. That is what I and some other trade union leaders have been trying to do in recent discussions with government. Our objective, put simply, is to create the conditions in which you will get, at worst, cooperation with, and at best, enthusiasm for the challenges among those who work each day to provide and deliver public services. Both my own union Impact and the Congress Public Services Committee have put a simple proposition to the government as a first step to making this a reality. We have recognised that the collapse in government revenues is real, and that as a result, radical transformation is required to protect and enhance our education, health, local services, public administration, and all the other services on which all of us, or most of us as citizens, depend. And we have reminded the government and senior officials that those who work to provide public services are not the greedy, lazy bogeymen of newspaper myth. They are human beings who, like any other human beings, do their best each day to provide decent services within the resources, structures and constraints that they are asked to operate within. They're not overpaid fat cats either. The figures I've been given, and I've been given these by the Department of Finance, paint a very different picture. For the most part, our public servants are not highly paid. 255,000 out of a total of 310,000 are on gross salaries below 60,000 a year. And of that 255,000, nearly 60,000 are paid below a gross salary of 30,000 a year. 74,000 are paid between 30,000 and 40,000 a year, and 126 are paid within that band of 40 to 60 a year. In truth, there's only over 9,000, just over 9,000 people who are on salary scales above 100,000 a year. And I have emphasised that these are gross figures that take no account of the impact of the various levies, including the additional 7.5% pay reduction in the form of the pension levy, which was imposed in March, which not surprisingly fails to feature in the headlines when comparisons are made between levels of public and private sector pay. And to humanise this story, I could show you scores, hundreds of emails I have received from people who work in the public service, earning just 30 or 40,000 a year, whose take-home pay has fallen by 50 euros a week, 75 euros a week, 100 euros a week plus. And these are people who describe their circumstances to me in terms of, my spouse worked in the private sector, they've lost their job, we're now depending on this reduced income. So to argue that these people should have a further 10, 20% or more taken from their purses or pockets and expect that they will then cheerfully and effectively contribute to the necessary transformation in our public services simply demonstrates, in my view, a fundamental inability to understand human nature. That's why, months ago, we sought a simple commitment that there should be no further cuts in public service pay and pensions. And we have also called for an agreed framework for dealing with jobs and employment issues in the public service to avoid the failed policies of the 1980s, when cuts and embargoes imposed solely by central decision critically damaged many services, created decades-long specialist shortages, and caused many of the problems that service users and taxpayers are still grappling with today. I have also said that if we have these commitments, unions will do everything to mobilise the constituency that we represent to deliver the transformation that is required, the scale of which I have already described. We understand what is expected of us. We understand that the work of those who provide public services will get harder. We know that citizens will judge our performance on ease of access, timeliness, and the quality of the services they receive, particularly as the recession increases their dependence on public services. And we know that the constraints on scarce resources will intensify pressures to secure efficiencies and, above all, responsiveness to change priorities and imperatives. Handled properly, we're up for it. And I don't believe this approach need necessarily jar with that of the government. Because earlier this month, when the Taoiseach addressed the Irish Congress of Trade Unions conference in Tralee, he invoked the need for a partnership approach to public service transformation. He said he believes staff were willing to deliver more with less in a situation where people depended increasingly on public services. And he rejected the business as usual response and said that public service unions are necessarily part of designing and delivering the response. But this is high risk territory. And let me use an analogy. All the stakeholders, the government, the unions, the politicians generally, the employers, the management bodies, the service users, taxpayers and workers, run the risk in this debate of disappearing into a Bermuda Triangle with three axes. The first axis is one where the government and the Department of Finance want to reduce spending by X, and the X is as much as 3, 4 or 5 billion, and decide the solution is that this requires huge cuts in payroll spending, which means cuts in jobs, pay, pensions, or some combination of the three. The second axis is one where those who work to provide public services and their representative bodies, the unions, won't accept further cuts in their core pay or pensions, and they want to retain secure tenure for existing staff, i.e. no involuntary redundancies. And aside from the question of morale, which I've referred to, both sides recognise that any attempt to impose cuts in these areas will inevitably lead to a row, possibly industrial action, which would massively disrupt services in the short term, and as we know from our experiences in the 80s and 90s, is likely to make the task of prosecuting any real reform virtually impossible. And the third and final axis is dealing with the needs of citizens, where the public want and expect improved services, even or especially if demand increases and budgets reduce. And I believe that Colin McCarthy's report must be assessed in this context as one among many aids and much advice that is now available to the government as it chooses and seeks to implement the policies that will determine how our public services and how our society will develop in the coming months and years. Right now, the strategies to deliver these apparently conflicting objectives are being presented at what I describe as a generalised wish list, disconnected largely from staff and the services to which they relate. And it goes back to my opening point, that for the guts of a decade, the government, the management, the employer bodies, my trade union colleagues have grappled with the problem of trying to negotiate national agreements on abstractions, words like redeployment, extended working days, flexibility, outsourcing, shared services, centralised procurement, and a myriad of other terms and measures so ill defined in terms of real service delivery on the ground that they sometimes appear to the citizen to have simply been plucked and xeroxed from an undergraduate business studies textbook. But of course these things can be real and meaningful, but they can only be real for any member of staff where they are applied to their personal working arrangements, and when the changes to these working arrangements are fully understood by them. And this is now the central dilemma which needs to be resolved in balancing national and local negotiations with unions so that we can deliver a real transformation agenda. And I believe this dilemma can be resolved by devolving the detail of change and transformation. Let's have the courage to give the available budget to those who have operational responsibility for managing and delivering services. And let the people who know the services and know the communities they serve agree the changes and flexibilities needed to ensure the best possible range and quality within the financial constraints and within frameworks that protect services and the staff who work to provide them. Ask the individual service providers, whether they're local authorities, health agencies, schools, or other organisations, to prepare their transformation plans. Local frameworks that can attempt to reconcile the apparently conflicting objectives. That is, transformations that can, as far as humanly possible, deliver the services people want and expect within government spending objectives. It is at this level, and only at this level, that words like redeployment, flexibility, shared services, and so on can really be translated into changes in working arrangements and work practices for individual members of staff, which in turn relate to operational realities, which at the same time will deliver the basic guarantees that we feel are necessary. I don't want to spoil the debate, but we need to recognise the negotiation that Don referred to in his opening remarks, because there is another course of action being contemplated and advocated. And that's a course of action that has nothing to do with reform or transformation. And it's simply to cut services, or better still, cut the pay of those who work to provide public services. It's often ideologically driven advocates using the simple language of balancing the books, and they see the maintenance of a range of quality public services as at best secondary and maybe at worst irrelevant to this imperative. And their contempt for the ordinary working people who deliver services fairly drips from the airwaves and Sunday newspaper pages, to which the people I represent have little or no access beyond what are times the heavily edited letters page. And it's no accident that this chorus of criticism has increased in volume and intensity in the wake of the present economic crisis. And I believe this is designed to do two things. The first, an immediate objective, is to divert blame and accountability away from the real culprits in our current economic catastrophe. But the long-term objective is to ensure that once the taxpayer has cleaned up the wreckage, they can go back to business as usual. And that business as usual for millions of ordinary working people and their families has delivered little over the last few months, but reduced living standards, disappearing pensions and mass unemployment. The unavoidable logic of their position is that those who caused the problem, the greedy and selfish individuals and organisations that created this recession in the minds of many ordinary working people, should emerge from this crisis stronger and richer than before. And that, in my judgment, simply won't work. It won't wash with the citizens of this country. It is increasingly clear, indeed it's crystal clear, that their main target is a substantial reduction in public service pay on top of what has already been imposed. And it's equally clear that they have more than one ear in government whose refusal so far to rule out public service pay cuts speaks volumes more than I have time to do at this late stage in my presentation. But if those government ears are listening this afternoon, I want them to hear this too. I have been clear, very clear in this presentation, and others I have made in recent months, that I believe public service unions and their members understand the scale of this crisis and the unprecedented response that this requires of us in terms of public service transformation. I have been equally clear, even more so than when I spoke to the summer school 2 years ago, that we must, can and will be participants in this, notwithstanding the difficulties and pain it will inevitably bring. We want to create a transformation in our public service through cooperation and agreement. I believe this is a harder but a better way than the alternative. And if we choose the alternative route, regretfully, based on what I have been told by tens of thousands of people over the last few months that work in the public services, this will lead to action, to reaction. And if that's the course of action that we end up taking, I don't believe there will be many, if any, winners if this choice is taken, least of all among the people who more than ever depend on our public services. Because the bottom line, and I'll finish on this, is that in any debate about public service organisation, delivery or transformation, it's the citizen that matters first and foremost. Full stop. Thank you very much indeed.